J.D. Vance is a retired Marine. He spent 6 months in Iraq as a combat correspondent as part of a Marine Corps public affairs unit. At the same time he was in Iraq, literally at the exact same time, another rising star in American politics, another increasingly recognizable face in American politics, Maryland Governor Wes Moore, was also deployed with the U.S. military. He was a captain in the U.S. Army, leading combat troops as a paratrooper with the 82nd Airborne in Afghanistan. Sort of incredibly, both of these men came back after their military service and wrote widely praised, highly accomplished, award-winning memoirs. Wes Moore's memoir is called The Other Wes Moore, One Name, Two Fates. It's a look at how two men from Baltimore with the exact same name, who grew up under similar circumstances, similar hardships, could go on to live very drastically different lives. The Wes Moore that we know went on to be a Rhodes Scholar and a White House Fellow and a captain in the Army. The other Wes Moore never escaped poverty, and he ended up in prison after being convicted of serious crimes. J.D. Vance's memoir is about growing up in rural Ohio and a family struggling with poverty and addiction. It's an examination of the struggles faced by white working-class Americans. Both of these memoirs by both of these young men, widely praised, both actually beautifully written and important books in their own way. Following military service and writing these celebrated autobiographies, both of these men have ascended to top positions within their own political parties. Wes Moore, of course, is now the serving Democratic governor of Maryland. J.D. Vance, of course, was just named as the vice presidential nominee of the Republican ticket after serving about a year and a half in the United States Senate. Now, we're about to speak with Governor Wes Moore. I'm going to say this before he gets here because he is not going to want to talk about this. But I will tell you behind his back, knowing fully that he can hear me, that as Democrats have been having a very emotional, all-in-the-family, kitchen table, tears in their eyes discussion about whether the beloved figure at the top of their party, Joe Biden, should remain at the top of the presidential ticket this year. Wes Moore is one of the rising stars in the Democratic Party who is now getting poll tested as a potential candidate himself. He is not doing that himself. Other Democrats and Democratic polling outfits are starting to test his prospects. Again, he will not want to talk about that. He has not expressed any interest in being on the ticket. He is, in fact, an outspoken, firm supporter of President Biden and indeed a surrogate for the campaign. And he joins us now. Wes Moore, governor of Maryland. Governor Moore, it is a real pleasure to see you. I hope you weren't listening.
Great seeing you. I was not listening, Rachel, but it's good to see you.
It's nice to see you, too. Let me start by asking you about J.D. Vance, which I'm sure you're relieved to hear the direction that I'm going with this. J.D. Vance, the vice presidential nominee, he's obviously from your generation. You're only a few years apart from one another. His background overlaps with yours in some interesting ways. I wanted to ask, you know, given some of those similarities, you obviously have arrived at radically different views on the country and how it ought to be governed. What do you make of his selection as President Trump's running mate?
You know, I've known J.D. Vance for a long time, and that's one of the reasons I could never support him as being the vice president of this country. Because at the same time that J.D. Vance is introducing himself to many people in this country, for those who've known him before, he's reintroducing himself to us. And there's something incredibly dangerous and problematic about that. Where I have to ask, and I really hope he's doing some soul searching and ask the question, is the ambition worth it? That we've watched this shape-shifting of J.D. Vance. That's incredibly troubling. And we're now talking about someone who is saying that he is fully for a nationwide abortion ban. We're talking about someone who has said that he has rallied against the Affordable Care Act and rallied against Social Security. This is a person who believes in extremist views when it comes to American isolationism. His values do not match the values of America, and do not match the values and the vision that for so many of us, for so many patriots, people who love this country, think about the actual direction that this country should be going in. And so it's a bit disheartening, frankly, where I know I said during the start of my campaign, I have no problem spending every day introducing myself to people who don't know me. But I refuse to spend a second reintroducing myself to people who do know me. And I think that's exactly what J.D. Vance is doing right now.
Governor Wes Moore, Chris Hayes here. I wanted to ask you about a race happening in your home state that I think shed some interesting light on the national race, given the pick of J.D. Vance and the abortion politics of J.D. Vance and Trump at the top of the ticket. The former governor of your state running for Senate, Republican named Larry Hogan, left with a very high approval rating, running in a state that is quite Democratic and quite supportive of abortion rights, essentially attempting to kind of moonwalk his way away from the Republican Party's position on abortion and try to get Maryland voters who are adamantly pro-choice to come along. Do you think he can pull that off? And what lessons are there to be learned from that for national politics, where I think we've seen some signs the Republican Party wants to try to do the same thing in tightly contested races?
No, and I actually don't think that the old governor is moonwalking. I think he's about facing. We are now talking about, it's amazing now hearing him saying that he is a pro-choice and independent thinker, when the truth is, when he actually had power, he vetoed legislation that enhanced privacy. He vetoed legislation that enhanced protection for both patients and providers. On my first day of office, I released $3.5 million of previously unreleased funds that went towards training providers because the old governor, who's now running for Senate, refused to release them for political reasons. And so it's not lost on anyone in our state that he was handpicked by Mitch McConnell to run for this seat. Mitch McConnell called it the greatest get of the year, getting Larry Hogan to run. But I think Larry Hogan is going to have a very difficult time trying to show the people of our state that you can be an independent while at the same time knowing you were recruited by Mitch McConnell. You've already said you were going to caucus with the Republicans, and you will vote with the Republicans, giving the Republicans the 51st Senate seat. And on issues that we care deeply about, I mean, abortion rights is going to be on the ballot in the state of Maryland to make it part of our Constitution. I think Larry Hogan has showed that he is not where the people of Maryland are. He is not pro-choice, and I think people will make sure we remember that in November.
Governor, it's your friend Alex Wagner. Last time I talked to you, we were talking about the black male vote. And, we had some polling to suggest that the Trump campaign was making inroads with voters of color, specifically black men. The Trump campaign launched some sort of awkward and ham-handed efforts to outreach to the black community. I do wonder, though, now that the choice of vice presidential running mate has been named, J.D. Vance, does not seem like a pick that is designed to appeal to a broad cross-section of the American public. And I wonder how you think his selection plays with among communities of color and with black men in particular, given his focus almost exclusively on white working-class grievance.
Yeah, I think Donald Trump has made it very clear who he's going to double down on and what he sees as the vision for the country. And it is true. We know that in order to get the support of African-American men, I mean, you have to go earn it, because there is a natural cynicism and a natural skepticism that is long-standing. And frankly, it honors and it acknowledges the history of this country. The history of this country has been remarkably uneven to African Americans and particularly African American men. And so in order to earn the vote, you've got to go earn it. And I think the thing is, when you're looking at the history of the Biden-Harris administration, there is actually a track record that they can talk about and a vision for the future that they can talk about. The Biden-Harris administration can actually talk about how they've been able to reduce the African-American unemployment rate to historic lows. The Biden-Harris administration can actually talk about the fact that we're watching the fastest start in businesses led by African-American men in over 30 years. The Biden-Harris administration can actually talk about the fact that we're watching a 60% jump in black wealth since the start of the pandemic under the Biden-Harris administration. There's a track record and there's a receipts that they can stand on. And frankly, not only is there not a track record that we're seeing with the Trump administration, there's not a vision for where we're going either. Hope and vision will win elections, and I think the Biden-Harris administration is the only campaign inside of this race right now that's actually adding a measurement of hope and vision for where we see African-American men in this larger panoply. And I see that, and I say that as the only African-American governor in this country. I know what kind of partner that I have and the kind of results that we're seeing in the state of Maryland. And I know what I want to see for the next 4 years is the kind of partnership that I have with the Biden-Harris administration.
Governor Moore, it's Joy Reid. How are you? Let me ask you this question.
Hi, Joy.
There's been a lot of football spiking, I think, on the Republican side. A lot of confidence that they're going to win even a state like Maryland, kind of dismissing the idea that Angela Alsobrooks can beat Larry Hogan, and just really confident that they're going to get that seat. What do you think that's based on? What is the mood inside of the state of Maryland when it comes to the presidential race as you've read it? And my second part of that question is, what do you think is the state of the outreach to younger voters? Because that is one of the stated weaknesses of the current Democratic ticket, in that younger voters are just not motivated. Are issues like abortion and Project 2025, do you think those are motivating enough to put Maryland out of reach for Republicans?
Yes, and one thing I'll say, Amy, candidate quality does matter. And the great thing, when you look at the Senate race in the state of Maryland, Angela Alsobrooks is a remarkable candidate. She's someone who I proudly endorsed early. She's someone who I actually did an event for earlier this evening. And she's someone who I will be proud to have as my partner when she heads to the Senate. And she is going to not just outwork the old governor, but she's someone who has a vision that actually matches where the state is. And your point about young voters is absolutely right. I mean, I think about it in our case, young voters was our fuel. They were our foundation. They're the ones that paid attention to our campaign when we were polling at 1%, and when I'm Not Voting was polling higher than Wes Moore. And I think the thing that we're continuing to see is you've got to be able to show not just a track record, but also the fact that you're bringing them on board. So when we look at in our state, where we've now had the most precipitous drop in homicides and violent crime of any state in this country, the last time the homicide rate was this low in Baltimore City, I wasn't born yet. And we've been able to do that work because we've been engaging with young people. When we were able to have, just a few weeks ago, have the largest mass pardon for cannabis convictions in the history of this country, where I personally pardoned over 175,000 cannabis convictions, because I don't understand how people can be punished for something that's no longer illegal in our state. We worked with young people to make that happen. So young people have to understand that they are not just a subject of the conversation. They must be part of the conversation. It's something that I believe in deeply in our leadership. It's something that we've been doing in the state of Maryland. And it's the reason why I know young people will ride to make sure that we get the election results in November that those who came before us hope for, and those who come after us that they deserve.
Maryland Governor Wes Moore, such a pleasure to have you with us tonight, sir. Really, thank you for making the time. Thank you.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.